How does an army marching on foot swallow entire kingdoms? How can riders with bows erase empires faster than news can travel? Today we break down 10 of history's most lethal war machines. Forces built not just to win battles, but to reshape the world. Welcome to War Machines. If you love military history, strategy, and the brutal mechanics behind conquest, subscribe and step into the ranks. They weren't just soldiers, they were systems, disciplined, engineered, and relentlessly optimized to destroy. From standardized weapons and mass logistics to cavalry storms that struck like a moving disaster, these armies didn't simply fight, they overpowered. Let's begin. Number 10. The Qin Dynasty. Army long before factories and modern warfare, the Qin turned conflict into something terrifyingly organized: war as production. While many ancient states still relied on heroic champions and handcrafted weapons, Qin commanders pursued something colder: repeatable results. The Qin state pushed a level of standardization that was almost unheard of for its era. Weapons weren't made as one-off masterpieces. They were built to spec, with consistent parts, measured forms, and strict oversight. That meant repairs were faster, replacements were easier, and entire units could stay functional even after brutal losses. It wasn't romantic, but it was effective. And Qin's scale was enormous. We're talking armies in the hundreds of thousands, sustained by a state that treated manpower and supplies as a single machine. Their internal system rewarded performance, not status, often with harsh incentives that turned the battlefield into a ladder of survival and social advancement. For Qin, war wasn't a contest of honor. It was territorial control through fear, discipline, and efficiency. On the field, they leaned into dense infantry formations and overwhelming missile fire. Crossbows and mass volleys weakened enemy lines before the main force ever closed the distance. Then came the push. Long spears, blades, and relentless forward motion. Even their equipment showed advanced thinking. Some Qin-era weapons demonstrate unusually strong resistance to corrosion, evidence of manufacturing control that wouldn't become widespread again until much later. The Qin didn't just conquer, they assembled victory. Number 9, the Persian Immortals. Now we move from industrial organization to something equally deadly: psychological dominance. The Persian Immortals were an elite force of the Achaemenid Empire, famous not only for combat skill, but for the terrifying idea that they could not be reduced. The secret wasn't a myth. It was logistics. Their unit was maintained at a fixed number, traditionally described as 10,000, with replacements ready at all times. If one fell, another stepped in quickly, minimizing visible gaps. To enemies watching from across the chaos, the line seemed unchanged, as if the formation could not be thinned. That perception alone could crack morale. The Immortals were drawn from the Empire's higher classes and trained for endurance, discipline, and versatility. They were not a single-purpose unit. They were adaptable. They could open with concentrated missile fire, then transition into close combat with short spears and blades. They functioned across deserts, mountain routes, and open plains. They weren't simply bodyguards. They were the tip of the spear that helped Persia project power across a massive map. Facing them wasn't just fighting troops, it was fighting an empire that looked endlessly reinforced. Number 8. The Carthaginian Army. Next, the army that humiliated a rising superpower on its own ground. Carthage didn't field a single uniform national force the way Rome did. Instead, under Hannibal Barca, it became a deadly coalition, an international strike force held together by leadership and strategy. Hannibal gathered fierce infantry, expert skirmishers, and cavalry that could dominate open terrain. Celtic fighters from the north, hard infantry from Iberia, slingers with frightening accuracy, and the famous Numidian horsemen, fast, aggressive, and difficult to pin down. Then came the move that still sounds impossible: crossing the Alps in winter. The march cost lives, animals, and equipment. But it achieved what few thought imaginable. It placed a hostile army where Rome believed it could never be. For years, Hannibal fought in Italy with limited support from home, surviving by speed, local resources, and relentless pressure on Qi. And, at Cannae, his army delivered one of the most devastating tactical demolitions in history: a double envelopment that surrounded a vastly larger Roman force and annihilated it. The scale of the loss forced Rome into emergency measures, scraping manpower from every corner of society just to keep breathing. Carthage under Hannibal didn't just win battles. It proved that strategy can turn a smaller army into a meat grinder. Number 7. The Great Heathen Army. Now, the lightning raids that turned rivers into invasion routes. The Viking forces remembered as the Great Heathen Army were not just chaotic raiders. They were mobile, adaptable, and brutally efficient at striking where defenses were weakest. Their key advantage was technology and access: the longship. Built with a shallow draft, it could cross rough seas and then slide into narrow rivers that ran straight into the heart of towns. That meant no warning. A settlement could wake up safe and be attacked by midday. Unlike slow feudal levies, Viking forces moved fast, hit hard, and disappeared before large armies could gather. Over time, raids evolved into campaigns. They pressured coasts, threatened major cities, and carved influence across wide regions, sometimes replacing plunder with settlement and rule. On land, they could form disciplined shield walls, wood and iron, locked together, then push forward while axes and spears broke formations at close range. Their impact was structural. Kings responded by building stronger fortifications and reorganizing defenses, changes that shaped medieval Europe for centuries. The Vikings didn't just raid, they forced an entire continent to rethink survival. Number 6. The Hunnic Horde. If the Vikings were a sudden knife, the Huns were a moving storm. The Huns, associated most famously with Attila, terrified late antiquity because they fought in a way that many settled empires couldn't process: pure mobility. They weren't tied to cities or walls. Their strength was movement, driven by herds, horses, and riders who lived on the march. A Hun warrior could rotate between multiple mounts, covering massive distances in a single day. That meant attacks could happen across different frontiers faster than opponents could coordinate a response. And they didn't conquer to govern. They conquered to extract tribute, resist, and consequences could be extreme, used deliberately as a warning to the next city. Their tactics were built around mounted archery and deception. They could fire accurately at speed, then retreat, sometimes on purpose to drag enemies into chaos, exhaustion, and ambush. Even their appearance added to the fear. Some groups practiced skull shaping from youth, creating a look that opponents found unsettling and alien, amplifying the terror that already followed them. The Huns didn't need to occupy your land. They only needed to convince you that fighting back meant ruin. Number 5. The Spanish tercios. Now we enter the early modern era. Pikes, gunpowder, and discipline so strong, it became legend. The Spanish tercios were among the most feared infantry formations for more than a century. They weren't just troops. They were a system of combined arms, structured, drilled, and dangerous in almost any terrain. While many armies still depended on knights, charges, or poorly trained levies, Spain created professional infantry that could hold against cavalry, resist chaos, and deliver consistent results. Their famous formations, dense blocks of pikemen with firearms supporting, created a brutal dilemma for enemies: rush them and get impaled, hang back and get shot. Tercios trained to maneuver under fire without dissolving into panic, and their endurance became part of their reputation. They could fight long, march far, and still maintain cohesion. Their internal culture also mattered. Soldiers weren't just forced bodies. Many volunteered for pay, status, and advancement. Units developed intense pride, sometimes so intense that delayed pay could trigger disciplined, organized mutinies rather than random desertion. For generations, the tercios were a symbol of battlefield control. Slow, steady, and crushing. They didn't need speed. They needed only to keep moving forward, together. Number 4, the Spartan army. Sparta was not a city that had an army. Sparta was an army that happened to have a city. Their entire society was shaped to produce heavy infantry, disciplined, fearless under pressure, and trained from childhood to obey the unit above the self. The agog, their harsh state training, began young. Boys were pushed into endurance, scarcity, and strict hierarchy. They learned to operate with minimal comfort, to endure pain, and to think like a part of a larger machine. The goal was simple: remove hesitation. On the battlefield, Spartans were famous for cohesion, especially in the hoplite phalanx. Shields overlapped, spears projected, and the whole formation moved like a single creature. Their reputation often did half the killing. The sound of a disciplined advance, steady, synchronized, could shake less trained opponents before contact even began. And their laws reinforced it. Retreat was not an option under normal circumstances. That mindset produced legendary stands, including Thermopylae, not as reckless drama, but as the harsh logic of their system. Sparta's lethality didn't come from advanced weapons. It came from turning citizens into discipline made flesh. Number 3, the Macedonian army, now to a force engineered for conquest. Macedonia under Philip II and Alexander. This was not just a strong army. It was a balanced weapon system. Philip II redesigned the battlefield with the Macedonian phalanx. Armed with the sarissa, a long pike that gave them reach and control far beyond traditional spears. With multiple ranks projecting points forward, enemies collided with steel so they could even strike. But Macedonia's genius was integration. The phalanx held the center, pinning opponents in place. Meanwhile, elite cavalry, most famously the companions, delivered decisive outrun. Fast, focused strikes into weak points. This anvil and hammer method was devastating when timed correctly. Their logistics helped too. Macedonia marched faster and carried lighter than many rivals, allowing Alexander to choose the moment of battle and force enemies to react instead of plan. Across years of campaigning and extreme distances, this system shattered armies that were often larger and wealthier. Macedonia didn't conquer by luck. It conquered because it fought like a designed machine. Number 2, the Mongol Horde. If speed itself could be weaponized, the Mongols proved it. Under leaders like Genghis Khan, the Mongol military became one of history's most efficient engines of expansion. Fast, disciplined, and terrifyingly adaptable. Each rider was a self-sustaining unit, often traveling with spare horses to rotate mounts and maintain relentless pace. Mongol forces could cover huge distances daily, appearing where defenders assumed they had time. They organized in a clear decimal structure, enabling command and communication even during chaos. But the most dangerous trait was learning. When they encountered advanced siege methods, they didn't ignore them. They absorbed them. Engineers from conquered regions were integrated, and new tools were used to break cities that believed walls made them safe. Their tactics combined mounted archery, feigned retreats, and coordinated encirclement. They could hit, withdraw, lure enemies into exhaustion, then turn and destroy them with volleys fired at range and at speed. They also understood fear as a strategy. Reputation traveled ahead of them, and surrender sometimes became a survival calculation for cities that knew what resistance could bring. The Mongols didn't just win battles, they turned entire maps into open terrain. Number 1, the Roman legions. At number 1, the army that didn't just conquer, it built a world. Rome's legions weren't undefeated, but no army matched their combination of resilience, organization, engineering, and long-term adaptation. Rome could lose catastrophically and return stronger, because Roman power wasn't a single commander's brilliance. It was a system: training, discipline, command structure, roads, supply lines, and the ability to learn from enemies. The legionary's weapon wasn't only the gladius, it was the shovel. Roman soldiers could march long distances, then build a fortified camp in a single evening. Ditches, walls, gates, and order. They raised bridges, engineered sieges, and turned terrain into advantage through construction. They operated like a mobile city. Engineers, medics, armorers, logistics, everything needed to sustain power far from home. On the battlefield, their flexibility mattered. Unlike rigid formations that shattered when disrupted, legions fought in units that could maneuver, rotate, and adapt on uneven ground. They could throw pila to break shields and formation integrity, then close in with controlled, brutal efficiency. A Roman soldier carried heavy equipment and rations, earning nicknames that reflected how much they hauled, but that weight was power, because it meant Rome didn't rely on supply miracles, it relied on preparation. If the Mongols were the lightning that burned across the horizon, Rome was the tide. Steady, methodical, and impossible to ignore. It absorbed enemies, reshaped provinces, and turned former rivals into new defenders. That is why the Roman legions stand at number 1, not because they never fell, but because they were built to rise again. So, which of these war machines do you think was truly the most lethal? Drop your pick in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and stay ready. Because the next episode dives into even darker corners of ancient warfare. Welcome to War Machines, where history isn't a story. It's a blueprint